Ingestion by A. Passing through B. To the excretion of C. The Human Centipede.
In 2009, Dutch director Tom Six wrote and directed a film called The Human Centipede. This film was about a crazed surgeon called Joseph Heiter who kidnaps 3 tourists and joins them surgically from mouth to anus. The film, in many ways, felt like the natural evolution of the torture porn era, which had been getting increasingly extreme throughout that decade. But according to Six, it was also inspired by the work of Takashi Miike and David Lynch, as well as, of course, one of the most notorious films of all time, Salò, 120 Days of Sodom. Naturally, The Human Centipede did shock and appall critics and audiences, but interestingly, many horror fans felt that the film didn't actually deliver on the extreme content that the title and the synopsis promised, and that actually the film turned out to be kind of tame.
100% medically accurate. One digestive system. Is this a perverted film you've been talking about?
As a response to this, Tom Six made a sequel, The Human Centipede 2. This film made the first Human Centipede look like the magic roundabout. Graphic depictions of violence, rape, infanticide, genital mutilation, torture, and of course, the consumption of human feces made this film truly one of the most shocking and controversial films since Salò. The film was so extreme that the BBFC refused to give The Human Centipede 2 any classification, claiming it was simply too extreme and potentially obscene. Join me as we continue our journey through the mind and body as we discuss one of the most shocking and depraved films of the 21st century, The Human Centipede 2. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. What a first episode to listen to. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. We are currently in our 6th season called Mind and Body, and this is part 27, in which we are going to be talking, as that intro suggested, about one of the nastiest films ever made, The Human Centipede 2, in spoilerific detail. Now, I want to be completely upfront about this, and I kind of want to start with a bit of a trigger warning. This movie is not one that I would necessarily recommend to everyone. I know I usually start every episode by saying give the film a watch before listening to our discussion. I'm not saying that about this film. Please don't feel as though you need to watch this film because we're covering it on the podcast, because, you know, this film isn't for everyone. It's nasty, it's horrible, and it is very triggering. And I just also want to give you a quick warning that we will talk about this film in depth in the way that we talk about any horror film, and because of that, we do talk about rape, we do talk about infanticide, we do talk about some of the most gruesome and grotesque imagery that this film portrays. So I just wanted to lay that out there. But I'm hoping, if people can stomach it, that they're still going to listen to this conversation regardless, because we've got some incredible guests this week, and I think some really fascinating discussions. Later on in this episode, I am going to be joined by none other than Laurence Harvey, the star of Human Centipede 2. He plays, of course, Martin, the guy who makes the Human Centipede in this movie. I asked him a little bit about what it was like to star in one of the most extreme movies ever made, and what it was like on set actually doing that stuff and being that character. So later on you'll hear a little bit of my chat with him, but first of all, joining me to discuss this movie in nitty-gritty detail, I've got the two absolute perfect guests for this. In fact, these two both joined me last series to discuss another extreme, controversial controversial modern classic Lords of Chaos, Queen of the Extreme Zobo with a shotgun, and practical effects artist extraordinaire who actually worked on Human Centipede 2, Dan Martin. So I sat down and chatted to Zobo and Dan together to ask them if this really is one of the most depraved and extreme movies ever made. So here we go. You have been warned. Here is my discussion with Dan and Zobo about all things Human Centipede 2. Hello, Zobo.
Hello, thank you for having me back.
Oh, thank you so much for being back. How's January been treating you so far?
Fucking awful, but there we go. We keep going, don't we?
We do. We keep pressing on. And I'm also joined this week by practical effects artist and co-host of the Arrow video podcast, Dan Martin. Hello, Dan.
Hello.
Hello. And how's everything with you? How's life?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. It's all a bit weird, but I'm surviving. I get to go to work, which is nice, because for some reason film is considered essential.
Well, I think me and Zobo wouldn't argue with that, right? I mean,
Well, yeah, like
That's
we all
true.
think film's essential, but God knows why the government thinks film's essential.
I love it. So we're here to talk about a film that... I always start every episode by sort of saying to listeners, look, go away and watch the film before you listen to us discuss it. I honestly don't know if I can do that with this film. And so I've I am sure you do, Dan. I very much have said to everyone, look, this is your own choice if you choose to sit through this, but equally you can just not, and feel free to still listen to our discussion, because I don't know if I could actually recommend this film. I want to ask you both about your relationship and history with Human Centipede 2, and obviously Dan as somebody who was actually involved in this film. But Zobo, first of all, let me ask you about the trilogy as a whole, because I've deliberately chosen part 2 and not part 1, because I find it more of an interesting film, right? Much more of an interesting one to watch and to talk about. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, the trilogy is an odd one. They're all very different movies. And the first one, it's actually, even though it's probably the most talked about purely because, I guess, of its release and everything, it's quite a boring movie, in my opinion. There's not that much to talk about it. And I guess the second one it's far more extreme in many, many ways. And there's a lot more things to talk about on that one. And then the third one, honestly, I'm not even sure what I watched when I watched that one, but I do remember making some videos on, I think it was when I had Snapchat, which doesn't really exist anymore. And just laughing through, I think it was pure shock at what I was watching. But, it's a laugh. The third one is fucking hilarious, but second one, maybe not so funny.
Yeah, tonally they're all quite different, aren't they? Dan, before you talk about how you got involved in Human Centipede 2, just as a film fan, as a horror fan, as an extreme cinema fan, what did you think of the first film, of the first Human Centipede?
So I liked the first Centipede, but I think, and what I'm about to say is possibly part of the catalyst for the second one existing. By the time I saw it had been hyped up in such a way that it wasn't as extreme as I had been led to believe.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the idea of Human Centipede is insane, and the reason it slipped so easily into the public zeitgeist is that, like, that's all you need. All you need is the title. So, like, South Park can do a thing, 30 Rock can do a thing. Like, they're all referencing Human Centipede because everyone has read the byline. Everyone's read the logline. Everyone knows that it's, what the basic idea is. And really, that's the only idea in the film. Like, not to besmirch Tom, but he's got it's essentially the lowest brow, highest concept film ever made.
Yeah. It really is. It's a one-liner, that first film, and the idea, right? And I think you're right. Like, I certainly found, Zoe, I don't know how you felt, like, when I heard what this film was about, I was also a little bit disappointed by how, in a way, restrained the first Human Centipede was in terms of, like, what I had maybe in my head before I saw it,
Oh, I was so disappointed. I mean, I think when you hear that it's going to be, a 3-person centipede joined by arseholes, that's medically correct with an intestine running through, especially as an extreme horror fan, you're going, oh God, this is going to be fucking gross. I cannot wait to watch it. And then you watch it and you go, well, yeah, there's a few bits that aren't that nice, but compared to what's out there in the extreme world, it's so tame. But a bit like you were saying, Dan, I think, it got so overhyped, and I think so many people never even saw the movie. They just read what it was about and freaked the fuck out over it, and it kind of blew up. And then us that like disgusting things watched it and were like, yes, it's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing. Like, that's the parade of light, like, standard, isn't it? To like hear a synopsis and lose your shit. to paraphrase, maybe directly quote, but I think to paraphrase Mary Whitehouse, I don't need to see filth to know filth. She didn't have a fucking clue what she was talking about. She sat there in a big chair with her long arms condemning other people's tastes.
It's so true, and that's it. Everyone knew whether or not they were ready to watch something like Human Centipede and whether or not they wanted to absolutely avoid it like the plague. So it's interesting, Dan, you mentioned that maybe in some ways that response that horror fans had, that kind of, maybe it's actually wasn't as extreme or wasn't as shocking as we thought / hoped it would be. Do you think that is what kind of then led to Human Centipede 2?
Oh, I absolutely know for a fact that it is. Tom at some point on set said, and again I paraphrase heavily, they complained it wasn't as extreme. All those fucking horror nerds, they said it wasn't as hardcore as they thought it was going to be from the title. Well, I'll fucking show them. I'll make the nastiest film they've ever seen.
And maybe he did. So let's get into it. Human Centipede 2. Zobo, if you can, just give us a little brief plot synopsis of the Human Centipede 2.
Oh gosh. Okay, so we follow Martin, who supposedly has what they like to call some learning difficulties, which, just going to point out, I worked with people with learning difficulties, and I'm going to say they don't usually go this far, but he has some learning difficulties, and he is obsessed with the Human Centipede, the first film. He has a little scrapbook. He also likes to masturbate over the first film, as you do. And his goal is to build a 12-person centipede, and I guess keep it for his own fascinations. And that's what he embarks on doing, and nearly succeeds with his little task.
He does. That's pretty much the gist of it, isn't it? So we're going sort of slightly more meta. We're coming like one layer out. In the Human Centipede 2, the Human Centipede exists as a film, right? As a fictional film, which is an interesting choice to make for this sequel. Before we get into the film, Dan, let me ask you, how did you come to be involved in it then? And tell us a bit about your involvement in the film.
So my involvement in the film is quite sort of happenstance, really. I had done a bunch of work with a special effects artist called John Schoonrad relatively early in my career. John is an amazing sort of old hand in the industry. John has been around since the 60s. He was a junior on in the mold shop. He moved on to set work for Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. He made the boulder, like him and a chap who I also work for called Kenny Wilson, made the boulder that chases Indy at the beginning of Lost Ark. And actually, the two of them are behind the boulder rolling it along in that sequence.
Oh my God, that's amazing. What a cool claim to fame.
But he ended up being part of the Henson's team, and he ran their Lifecast studio for a number of years. Mm-hmm. So when Henson's closed down, he, like so many other Henson's sort of alum, set off on their own. And I worked for him as well. He was hired by a company I was working for to run a music video for The Darkness for their Christmas single, Don't Let the Bells End.
Yeah, a classic.
Yeah. And I got sort of roped into that because I got a bit of dental tech experience. So I made Justin Hawkins' teeth for that.
Oh my God, amazing.
For that music video. And that was the first time I worked with John, and he and I got on like a house on fire. And so when Centipede 2 came up, John was the guy that got the contract, not me. But he had a bigger job, and it may even have been Kingsman. But like, you know, he did Rambo, the fourth of the Rambo films. He did Kingsman. He did all these movies, so he's doing big stuff. He gets Centipede 2, which I think is like a bit of fun for him. And then when another bigger job comes up, he phones me and he says, "Look, will you come in and manage Human Centipede 2 for me?" And I'm like, "Yeah, fucking of course I will." What are you talking about? So I went to John's place. He had a studio in Elstree, still does, and he'd done all the live casts, so I didn't have to do any live casts. He'd made all the fake bums, but that was it. Everything else was sort of up for grabs. Early on in the film, I said to Tom, "Look, I don't want to do John out of work, but I feel like we're spending a lot of money on stuff you're never going to be able to use. Like, we like, there's a checklist that the MPAA and the BBFC and whoever have as to what they will and won't let through, and you're basically just ticking off all the stuff that they don't allow. So you're not going to be able to use any of this. Like, you're spending good money, and I'm enjoying making it, but you're spending good money making this stuff, and we're not, like, would it not be better to have extra takes on the stuff we are going to be allowed, the stuff earlier in the film? Mm-hmm. Like, we'll do other extra stuff." And he's like, "No, well, that's the point. That's the whole point." Like, everyone fucking got on me on the internet about the first movie, saying, "Oh, it wasn't as extreme as we thought it was." Like, all the like he said, all the horror nerds were saying, "Oh, it wasn't extreme enough. It wasn't extreme enough." He's like, "So now I'm going to show them. I'll make the most extreme film ever made." And I said, "But it's going to get banned." And he said, "Well, I want it to get banned. That's the whole point. Like, we want this film to get banned." And it was like the planets aligning. Like, everything snapped into focus. And I'm like, "Oh, we're making Salo." Like, there's an interview with Pasolini about Solo where he describes it as his attempt to make an unwatchable film. Like, he wants it to be a film people can't make it all the way through. And I was like, "Oh, fuck, okay. Yeah, okay, we're making a film people can't watch. I get it. Okay, we're doing this." And so then it's in for a penny, in for a pound. And he was a very like, generous collaborator, Tom. Tom was very generous in that, like, I could be like, "Oh, well, this would make this 10 times nastier if we did this thing." And he was like a child in a candy shop. He'd be like, "Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that thing. That's great. Can you do that?" And then I'd turn up an hour and a half later with like a bunch of extra nasty things I'd made.
Oh my god! It sounds like this was
awesome.
Just having the best time. Yeah.
Oh, it was the closest I've come to, like, a sort of the entire film was the experience you get when you do a show and tell with a director.
I mean, we've got lots to discuss in this film. Zoe, let me ask you. I mean, I find this hilarious because you're queen of the extreme, Zobo. I mean, we've talked together over on Patreon over the last few weeks. We've done Salo, we've done Cannibal Holocaust, we've done Guinea Pig, we've done a Serbian film, Irreversible. This is the film that made you sick. Is that right? It actually made you sick.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I watched Salo, and yeah, all right, the shit eating's quite bad, but this one, I think it's just so over the top, and I'm sure we'll come on to it in a bit more detail, but when they start kind of shitting themselves, that I was like, I'm pretty sure I can smell this fucking film through the screen. And I remember my dad bought it and was like, "Look, it's because you couldn't get it at the time, because obviously it was I think it was banned, so he I don't know where he got it, and he put it on the shelf and he was like, "We'll watch that at some point." And one night I was like, "Oh, I'm just going to go for it. Like, he's never going to want to watch it." And yeah, I paused it at one point. I was like, I'm just going to be sick a little bit. I'm going to have like a tactical chanda because I'm not really feeling too well watching this.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And I think it's the only film that I've actually felt like physically sick and been physically sick at. But I think it's just a testament to your work, Dan, and the team's work on how grimy and nasty it really does come across.
And the thing is, it really does feel like, I mean, it's interesting, Dan, you mentioned it's like, it was like a checklist of things that the BBFC would ban, right? It feels like it is just a film full of scenes of stuff that will make you sick / shocked / angry, right? I mean, that's kind of it feels like it was almost reverse engineered to be that first, right? And then story or whatever else second. It feels like that's all Tom Six was aiming to do with this film.
Yeah, I mean, I don't in any way want to besmirch Tom, but I have on occasion referred to it as an accidental masterpiece. and I think that one of the reasons it works so well, and I know that you and I, Mike, have talked out of sequence about the idea of the division between the comedic and the absurd and the grotesque.
Yes.
But I think that there's this sort of tacit understanding with an audience going to see the second film in the Human Centipede franchise, where you know that you're not getting any accidental views. Everyone sitting down to watch that movie knows to some extent what they're in for. Like, they're all expecting something that's going to affront them, that's going to try and offend them, that's going to try and gross them out. The first movie, the name aside, because what the fuck were you expecting, probably had a handful of people who didn't know what they were in for and were horrified, and they're the ones that said that it was an insane and extreme movie, and they're the ones that garnered it the kickback where everyone was like, oh, it's not that extreme. So the second one is like, you know what you're here for, but you have no idea how far it's going to go.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the reasons it works as a film, for me, is that it is a slow pushing of the needle from the absurd into the grotesque. And so everyone has a point in that film where it maybe is a bit too much. And I've seen it... I've seen that film, I think, 4 times. One time I've watched it at home with my wife, who left during the film, and a friend who at the end was like, yeah, that was a bit much. But the other 3 times I've seen it with an audience. And the first of those was the cast and crew. And that was indelibly the crux of my experience with that movie, because even though we'd all been there, even though we'd all seen it, even though we'd all forgotten what human nudity was because we were so brutally exposed to it, like, when we watched that screening, there was everyone's chuckling and laughing because ha ha ha, they killed that man, and ha ha ha, they shot that person in the foot, and ha ha ha, they stoved that woman's head in. And then as the movie goes on, those laughs kind of slowly become like, it's 100%, it's 90%, it's 80%,
Yes.
it's 50%, it's 20%, and then eventually no one's laughing. It's crossed everyone's threshold.
Yes. I think that's true.
And it's but it's so perfectly gradiated that it's like a barometer. Like, no one comes back. No one finds something too much and is then okay with something later. It's always like, and I'm out. And some people, they're out early enough that they've just got to leave. And some people, like that journalist in Cannes, are so out that early on that they get up and they say, I don't know about you lot, but I'm not sitting here for this filth. And then they vomit in the aisle, and then they pass out and headbutt the door handle on the way out and break their nose. And then they have to have paramedics called to them in the foyer. So
Classic Dan Martin film. Yeah. It's true. It is like it's a slow, solid, it's like an exercise in what you can take, isn't it, in a way? It's really interesting. And, I was thinking, Zoe, I don't know why I did this, but I watched this and a Serbian film in the same week. And while a Serbian film gets more and more, it has a similar trajectory, right, where it gets more and more extreme. In a way, I found that one, actually, I tended to find it so absurd that I actually did laugh more and more in a Serbian film, whereas I think I agree with what Dan was saying, that this one actually gets really kind of depraved and grimy and nasty towards the end, doesn't it? In a way that you're not quite expecting maybe when you start watching it. Do you think it's... I wonder whether it's got something to do with the way the film just looks as well. There is... obviously, it's black and white, and we'll talk about that because there's a colour version as well, isn't there? But it feels a little bit more... I don't know, just kind of like cheap and grimy in the way it looks compared to the first film as well. Do you know what I mean, Zoe, by that? And I think that adds something to it.
Yeah, it does. And I mean, firstly, I've got to agree with Dan on kind of the laugh factor, because I know when I was rewatching it, Mike, I text you and I was like, oh, this is hilarious. I was like, I forgot how funny this was. And then by the end of it, I was like, I feel like I should delete that message because I am not fucking laughing anymore. I was like, yeah. And then so I watched it in black and white, and then I rewatched it in color because I actually hadn't seen the color version. And rewatching it again, which I did at I think it was 6 a.m., which was a really bad idea. I was like, this is, you know what? It's weird. I thought that the color version would be worse.
It's not.
Yeah, it's not. Actually, I felt like with the black and white version, my mind almost filled every shadow in that it was either blood, shit, or vomit, or sperm, or even just like a little, cocktail of all four of them. So when you watch it in black and white, you're right, it feels so grimier than in color, because I think your mind just, you know all of the bodily fluids that are there in the film, and you see kind of the acts of violence or sexual depravity, and you fill in the blanks, and suddenly, for instance, that kind of warehouse, the whole thing is just covered in stuff, like bodily stuff. But when you watch it in color, it's actually not. Some of it's just a bit of damp on the floor or something. I mean, it does kind of end up, I think the last scene, there's a shit ton of fucking blood all over the floor.
Oh, yeah.
But, and also, you get to see the lovely shit in full colour smeared on cheeks. But yeah, there's something about the black and white version that just feels so much grosser than the colour version.
Do you know what I loved, though, that I discovered on second watch? That in the black and white version, there's one moment when the shit comes out and it's brown, right? It's like a Schindler's List-esque kind of colour moment in the black and white, which I never noticed first time round, which is absolutely amazing. Dan, tell us a little bit about this, because what I've read is that Tom Six decided to make it black and white because of how gory and gratuitous it was. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I can't speak to whether or not he watched it and realised it would be more horrific in black and white and therefore decided to make it black and white, which is entirely possible, or whether he felt like it was some last-minute recoil from the hand of the censor. But when we made the film, we had no idea it was going to be in black and white. It was interesting because we did Fields of England almost directly afterwards, and I approached all the effects in Field of England so differently because I knew it was going to be in black and white. And I knew, having watched Human Centipede 2, how, all the bits where I was like, well, I would have done that differently if I'd known it was going to be in black and white.
It's really interesting, and I think it really does, like you said, Zoe, because I didn't watch the whole thing again, because I was like, I'm not watching this another time. Twice is enough. But I kind of skimmed through it in a colour version, just to see, and I watched some of the nastiest bits, and I didn't necessarily find it more shocking because it was in colour, which was interesting. Yeah, and I think you're right, that black and white, I don't know, there's a cheapness to it, there's a scuzziness to it. It could almost feel like a home movie or a snuff film or something, and there's a verite vibe. And I think that's interesting because we're in the quote-unquote real world here, where the first film exists as a film, right? So I think that is interesting. And speaking of, Zoe, let me ask you about that. This idea, and again, does this film warrant this kind of academic thought? I don't know, but this idea that, the film could be commenting in some way on horror, cinema, and the way it affects people. Clearly, this is a film, right, about this man who is this crazed fan. He's obsessed with the Human Centipede to the point where he masturbates over it. And now he's copying the crimes he's seen on screen. Is this, how effectively does this film for you, Zoe, kind of comment on that accusation that people put towards horror films, that they turn everyone into psychopaths?
I love Tom Six's approach to everything. He's like one of my favourite people to follow on Twitter, because he's just himself, and he just doesn't give a fuck. And I just love that. I really love that. And I think what he does, for me anyway, is I think he understands the relationship that film fans have with extreme cinema. I think he understands that it's not that we take it, you know, so many people, and I know that we're going to discuss a Serbian film at some point, Mike, but I know so many people, they get so angry at how someone could watch a film that's so extreme and so violent and so gross, and they often forget that it's just a movie, which is obviously quoted in Human Centipede 2, where he starts screaming, "It's only a movie," and I think that's kind of Tom Six's point, is that, you know, yes, you can completely push the boundaries of the audience. You can go further than you've ever gone before. You can show the most grotesque, disgusting, controversial things on screen. But at the end of the day, it's just a film, and media does not push a person to become, you know, someone like Martin, for instance. And I think, you know, Human Centipede 2 is probably a bit of his commentary on the fact that people didn't even watch the first film, and they got so obsessed with the fact that it was about this human centipede. And those were the people that were going, "Oh, anyone that watches this is sick." But those were the people that were so obsessed with it that they couldn't stop fucking talking about it. So I think it's just, you know, Tom Six does it in an interesting way, for sure, with Human Centipede 2, but I think it's actually quite clever. And I think, you know, as an extreme cinema fan, that's why you can kind of laugh at it a bit, because you go, right, I see what he's saying here, amongst all the griminess of it. And I just really like that. I like that he doesn't take it seriously. He goes, it's just a fucking movie, and we can do what we want. And the BBFC, they can censor it and ban it, but at the end of the day, it's just fake. It's not real.
It's true. It's just props and actors and everything else, isn't it? Dan, the film, you mentioned earlier, you know, that it's kind of, he's kind of making his own version of Salò here, right? This, for people that don't know, I'm sure most of you have heard of Salò, this absolutely kind of infamous movie from the mid-70s, directed by Pasolini, which does contain some of the most kind of depraved human acts imaginable. It kind of, and it's weird, it's framed in an almost kind of art house cinema way, but you see there sexual violence and mutilation. You also see shit-eating, coprophilia, which is, in, you know, one of the most controversial points and infamous points in the film. Is Human Centipede 2 on a par with Salò in terms of not just the shocking imagery, but also that kind of the merit, I suppose?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you've got to remember that Salò was also banned by the BBFC on its initial release, and it's only that with the benefit of hindsight that it's become part of the BFI archive.
Yeah. It's so highly regarded now, isn't it, that film?
Yeah, and I'm not saying that in another 20 years the Human Centipede 2 is going to become part of the BFI archive.
I hope so.
But I think what I am saying is that outrage is entirely calendar specific.
Yeah.
And that what we consider horrible now, like, and then on top of that is, like, you got to remember that, like, what Human Centipede 2 was 2011, was released in the UK, right?
Yeah.
2012.
Yeah.
2012 was the same year that we had the Aurora shootings in Colorado, because of Batman Begins. And that's like a much more direct connection between an act of violence and a film.
Yeah.
You know, this literally in a film, this kid turns around and shoots people in the cinema during the movie. Yeah. And yet that film is in no way hampered by the legacy of that horrific and tragic event. And so I think that so many of these, like the grotesquerie and the negative influence of movies and video games and all that stuff, it's just a convenient foothold for the professionally outraged.
We've kind of talked around the film this whole time, and I think it's nearly time to actually get into the specifics. Let's talk about what it is about this film that makes it so extreme, and what I want to do is kind of go through it almost scene by scene, but I guess major set piece by major set piece, and we'll sort of talk through our thoughts on it. But before that, before we get into the film, let's hear a little bit of my discussion with the actor who starred in this film. This is the guy who played Martin, who, you know, now I think his face has kind of become synonymous with this film, right? This horrible, depraved film, and he plays this horrible, depraved character. I sat down and chatted to the actor Laurence Harvey about what it was like to play Martin and what it was like to star in the grossest movie of the 21st century. So, here is my discussion with Laurence Harvey. Okay, this week on the podcast, I'm very excited to be joined by star of the Human Centipede 2, Laurence R. Harvey. Hello, Laurence.
Hello, Mike.
Thank you so much for joining me. So let me start off by asking you something that we've been kind of discussing and debating. We've been talking about a lot of extreme cinema on this podcast recently. Is the Human Centipede 2, in your opinion, the most extreme movie of the 21st century? Is it the most extreme movie since Salò in 1975?
Well, I'd say no to both of those questions. Initial questions. There's a lot worse, more extreme things out there. But I think what it does is it had a kind of mainstream. It kind of entered the mainstream, kind of because the first film, which wasn't particularly explicit in its goriness and so on. So therefore, people were already aware of the concept, and then when Human Centipede 2 came along, it obviously had more of an impact than, say, an underground film or something, you know. So yeah.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about how you came to sort of star in this movie.
It's very, very boring. Just my agent got in touch with me and set up an audition. Mm-hmm. Initially, my agent said, there's some people from Amsterdam want you to be in a sex film. And I said, are you sure? They said, well, I've looked at the website and it says Six Entertainment Amsterdam. Entertainment for adults as a banner on the website. And I said, really? So what's the title of the film? And then obviously when he said Human Centipede 2, I was already aware of the first film with it being on at Fright Fest. So yeah.
So you'd already seen the first film, had you? When
I hadn't seen it because it was just doing the festival circuit. I think its premiere was Fright Fest at the end of August, and this was like February the following year. So it was doing the festival circuit, and I'd read reviews from Fright Fest and from Fantastic Fest in Austin, and some other film festivals that it had played at. Yeah, and it kind of intrigued me anyway.
What were your thoughts when you first sort of read the script and this character of Martin, who you went on to play? What did you were you at all sort of worried or trepidatious about starring in a film like this?
Well, the thing is, when we had the audition in the morning, Tom had invited people from the cast, the potential cast and crew members to a screening in Soho of the first film. So I saw the first film, and I liked how there's obviously kind of elements of like 70s policiers in there, as well as, there's a bit of a feel of The Vanishing, of George Clooney's The Vanishing, that European sort of... those kind of European elements anyway, and there was a mix of high art and low art because of the Salò references, but also I mean, the story is a pretty bog standard kind of mad scientist film, but then it's Dieter's performance that really carries it. And I kind of liked that mix of high and low, if you know what I mean. Because for the first half hour you're wondering, is this a good film that's taking the piss out of bad films, or is it just a bad film? And So I trusted Tom, and then in the audition there was no script. It was just Tom took me through the whole film scene by scene verbally. So it was a discussion, and as he was going along, I was going, oh, that's just like Society, or that's like the All Night Long trilogy. Where so it's like I mean, at that time I was heavily into sort of Japanese gore films, and I mean, generally I love Asian cinema anyway. But at that stage, I was going through the Guinea Pig series and the All Night Long series, and getting love of category 3 films, and stuff like that. So I was excited to be in a gory film. So yeah, it didn't faze me whatsoever.
Oh, that's really cool. So you were already, have you been a sort of lifelong genre horror fan then, would you say?
I've always had an interest in horror, but I'm more kind of the artsy kind of end of things. So it's kind of Jodorowsky and stuff like that. But also the kind of semi kind of undergroundy film, like York Buckarite's films and stuff like that. So
yeah,
and then other kind of extreme underground things like the Richard Kearns short films and the Cinema of Transgression and so on. So.
And, I'm sure it should be of no surprise to anyone that you seem like such a lovely, friendly guy.
It's all an act.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you ever get any kind of... Because again, I suppose what's really interesting about the Human Centipede 2 is that it is sort of poking fun at and commenting at that accusation, right? That horror drives people mad or makes people want to replicate things.
Well, yeah, I mean that's explicit what it's going after.
Yeah.
I mean, Tom said it was very much a reaction to the audience reaction of the first film. Like people did say, "What if somebody copies this?"
Yes,
and so it was kind of well, let's see. I mean, because obviously, if somebody's watching a film and they go and copy it, they're not necessarily going to be a trained doctor, so things are going to get messy, and so that was kind of Tom's logic of pushing. It's his way of pushing the gore, but also his way of kind of undermining that sort of causal relationship with horror films and violence.
And tell me a little bit about what you made of Martin as a character and, when you sort of brought him to life. Because I do find, actually, there is, as despicable as his actions are, there is something of a sadness about this man, right? He's clearly a victim himself of bullying and abuse and so much else. And tell me about sort of finding that balance in the character.
Well, I mean, right from the start, Tom said that, he'd talked to a doctor about the first film. He talked to a psychologist about victims of abuse in the second film. And, I'm not saying it's a treatise on the mental conditions of abuse victims, but it's more that he wanted to get across that Martin was a damaged individual, and then audiences' sympathy should be with him. But at the same time, I didn't want to play Martin as like a mentally disabled person, but I wanted to have that kind of disconnect between his emotions and his actions, or for to be a delay or a sense that the audience could sense that he's acting out emotions rather than actually feeling them and expressing them. It's more that's the kind of area that I was interested in, rather than trying to portray any realistic medical psychosis.
Absolutely. What was it like then? I mean, it's such a grueling experience to sit through the film. What was it like making it? What was it like on set, particularly in some of those, really kind of gruesome scenes?
For me, it was great fun because I wasn't crawling on the floor in all the grit and stuff. I mean, I've always kind of been interested in special effects and getting to look at Dan's work particularly and John Schuneran's stuff on the film was really kind of fascinating for me, and seeing how everything was constructed and put together was interesting. But also, I'd sort of come from a background of performance arts, and I was kind of interested in Julia Kristeva's writings on horror, and there's this whole notion of the things that are internal becoming external.
Yeah.
That's the source of horror. So I was conscious of Martin being sweaty, and I was kind of coughing up phlegm and dribbling spit, and you know that thing children do where they bubble spit in their lips. So I was doing that a lot on the thing, and so it's all about sort of that kind of making the internal external, and which obviously with the shit moment in the was is quite explicitly so. So yeah, to me it was kind of interesting and fascinating from a coming at it from a performance art point of view, not just simply as an actor. So yeah,
that's really interesting, and it is a type. All of those things are still kind of, you know, taboo things. They're still things that make people wince or recoil, aren't they? That kind of stuff, dribbling, spitting, whatever it might be. It's. We've been talking a lot on this podcast about
it's the vomit, horror, shit, and sperm, and everything, isn't it?
The abject. It is. It's and I suppose that's the thing. This film, your performance, and everything about the film confronts people with that, right? Confronts people with what they're very uncomfortable seeing, I suppose. Yeah.
But again, there's also a kind of celebratory aspect, which I think is true of a lot of horror films, and a kind of celebration of the abject. I was kind of interested in, as well as reading Chris Taber, I was reading about the Carnivalesque and Bactine's writings on that, and the way that, because I was coming at it from an interest in disability, that I have a condition myself, and it was sort of trying to get to grips with that. So there's that kind of celebration of the shit, puke, and spit and pus kind of thing as well.
Absolutely.
You know.
Yeah, it's true. It's a kind of, and there's a balance, isn't there? Because when you have something like a slasher movie or something, and that kind of like outrageous amounts of blood will often get like a laugh and a cheer from a horror audience at Fright Fest, for example. You know, it's really interesting. But actually, one thing that Dan said to me is the film works as a really interesting sort of litmus test for what you can and can't handle. Is that, you know, it slowly and progressively gets more and more sort of depraved and upsetting, to the point where the people that are still left in the cinema watching the film by the final section are like usually no longer laughing. You know, it's like it's gotten that dark as it goes on.
I mean, when we saw it at the cast and crew screening, it had I physically felt pushed back into my seat by the force of it, which the only other film that had done that to me was Once Were Warriors, and that's kind of because of the domestic abuse situation and forcefulness of violence in that. Rather than any horror film, you know. So I was kind of interested. I'm glad that the film came across like that.
Yeah, it knows it. There's a tonal balance, I think, isn't there, in this film, which I think is very interesting. And actually, even in your performance, because there's, you know, the moments when I think, you know, it's outwardly funny are those moments when they're all shitting, and the moment when you're trying to get them to do it and you start going like that. I mean, that stuff is just. It turns into the kind of absurd, funny stuff, doesn't it?
I mean, one of the things in sort of creating, or when I was working on Martin, it was this notion of like, usually you have a monster, and Frankenstein or the Wolfman or whatever, or they've got makeup so they look sort of damaged or whatever. You know, the evil made external kind of thing. But then you see the humanity beneath that. So particularly in the monsters you have pity for, it's like they seem grotesque on the outside, but then you sense a heart underneath. And it was trying to do that, but without any makeup. So I was drawing on like early, you know, silent cinema comedy, where you have Chaplin who can beat somebody over the head with an iron bar, or sort of, you know, do quite violent, outrageous things to others, and you accept it and take it as because he's the little man with greater societal impulses sort of bearing down on him or against him, kind of thing. And that's kind of what Martin is as a character.
And of course there is. I mean, one of the things probably that upset people like the BBFC so much is that there is also the kind of there's a sexual violence to this film as well, isn't there? And there's those kind of I mean, one of the moments I really struggle with is the sandpaper wank, but also later on, of course, there's the kind of overtly kind of sexual assault with the barbed wire towards the end and everything. Were you guys ever worried about sort of filming scenes like that for the film?
Well, I thought that the sandpaper masturbation and the barbed wire around Martin's penis would be cut by the BBFC.
Yeah,
I knew that would happen anyway. But the rape, I thought, was important in that you could conceivably, because Martin's an underdog, so you go along with his first few actions, and even as it gets worse and worse, you can still hold some sympathy for Martin.
Yes.
But by the rape, you should be, you should have lost all sympathy for him by then. And but he's still the same person and still acting in the same way. It's just his actions have gone too far, kind of thing, by that stage. And that's, and I kind of thought, I thought it was important, but also I think a lot of that is down to Emma Locke's performance as well. And what's also important is that it's not just a rape of an individual; it's the whole. It's kind of Martin, the creator, becoming one with his creation, the centipede. It's like Carolee Schneemann's early performance photos where she builds like an installation and then she photographs herself inside of them. So that was my view of Martin becoming one with his creation, kind of thing. But it's done in a way that's like, even in the first film, the centipede is kind of sexual, but it's not made explicit, or it's not really touched upon. So in this film, that it's made sort of not explicit graphically, but explicit in thematically. So
yes,
yeah,
that's so interesting. Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I think you're right about that. That it's certainly the turning point. If you haven't already turned on Martin by that point, if you haven't already found him a monster, then that really is the moment, isn't it? Because there are moments earlier on. One observation I realised is that you don't really see him killing any children, right? Is that right? Because he spares the little boy in the car park.
He doesn't kill any children in the film.
Yeah, and of course there's the infamous baby death scene at the end, but that's nothing to do with him, technically, right? Yeah. So
in fact, he would probably save the baby.
Yes,
if he could, but
yeah. Because I guess there is that. It's that there's a childlike quality to Martin, I suppose, right, in the way you've played him as well. But
the children are violent and nasty too.
Absolutely.
They're horrible buggers.
They are totally
little sods.
So, how were you kind of expecting the reaction that it got? I mean, obviously, it wasn't given a classification by the BBFC, which essentially meant it wasn't available. Obviously it was heavily cut. And, did you kind of know this was coming? Did this feel inevitable to you? Or, what was your reaction?
I thought with the BBFC, we'd submit it. They'd say, cut out these scenes. I knew that the sandpaper scene, the barbed wire.
Yeah.
And trim the rape scene. That's what I thought they'd do.
Yeah.
But then the BBFC came out with a press statement, which I thought was utterly ridiculous. Mm-hmm. The thing is, there's nothing in that film that isn't in other films. It's just the way that it's done is more impactful, because it kind of doesn't feel. It feels like it's getting stronger and stronger, and it's not going to stop. Kind of thing. Do you
think it's also to do with the way it looks? Like there's that sort of sheen of the Human Centipede one, right? That is kind of gone from this. There's a sort of gritty, verite, snuffy look almost to this second film as well, isn't there? It's a sort of tonal thing, I feel like.
Yeah, if it had been slick and glossy as so hostile or something, I'm sure it wouldn't have made the impact that it did.
Yeah. When I sit and talk to people like you and people like Dan who have been involved in the film, you know, it hits home how much this is just... It's just make-believe, it's just props, it's just actors, it's like nobody, no people, no. There's no harm, is there? There's no real harm. And in a way, you kind of thought we were sort of past that when it came to the BBFC sort of pulling things like that.
Yeah, and also I think because it's a horror film, because it's a gory horror film, I think people don't think it's that intellectual or intelligent, and I think there's a lot more intelligence in it than it's often given credit for.
Yeah, no, totally. I think that is fair enough. So finally then, let me ask you, how have you found personally, as an actor, as an individual, how have you found the impact, the reception, the legacy of this film to be on you and your career? You know,
I'd be lying if I said, if I didn't say that it was a two-edged sword, you know. I mean, it's been good in the sense that initial year, 2 years after the film came out was amazing, and just going to film festivals and so on and doing conventions and so on was fantastic. It did lead to a couple of other films like The Editor and Attack the Adult Babies and so on, but it was also kind of frustrating in that you tend to get offered like bad zombie films, reiterations of the same character, or even less fleshed out than Martin was, and so on. So yeah, it's not been particularly positive in moving into different directions.
Yeah, I suppose it must be an interesting thing, and I've spoken to a few people like this, sort of actors in cult horror films or that kind of thing, where it's like you're in everyday life not being recognized, but then horror circles and horror conventions, you must now be like a very recognizable face, right, when it comes to appearing at Fright Fest or whatever.
Yeah, no, I'm recognized in everyday life. It's just
are you?
Casting directors don't recognize me.
Do you ever get any negative stuff from just people in the street because of this film?
Oh yeah, sometimes, but
oh, God.
But to be honest, the negative stuff was more online. But then, you know, it's been 10 years this October, so yeah, it's kind of quietened down quite a bit. So,
well, thank you so much, Laurence. Final question, which I ask all of my guests. It's a difficult one, but what is your favourite horror film?
I don't know. I mean, the thing is that, you know, I go for the classics. So it's either going to be Carrie or The Exorcist, you know. So
ooh, yeah.
I'll say Carrie and The Exorcist are my favourite.
Yeah, fair enough. Good choices.
When the big studios were sort of doing what were considered to be B movie genres and actually putting them together with interesting directors.
Yeah,
at the time.
Incredible.
You know, so.
Laurence, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Slušaj me pažljivo. Sprema se nešto veliko.
Ti si porno glumac koji želi da zna o čemu se radi u filmu.
Well, that was a little clip you just heard there from the one movie that potentially rivals the Human Centipede 2 in terms of one of the most shocking and depraved movies of the last 20 years. That was a Serbian film. A film which, to this day, I think still not just kind of upsets people, but actually angers people. I've noticed on social media, if ever you mention the title of a Serbian film, people are like, fuck that film, never giving that film any of my time. Well, fair play. I did give the film some of my time, and over on Patreon in the next couple of weeks, me and Zobo with a Shotgun and Brad Hansen are going to conclude our mini-series on extreme cinema by discussing a Serbian film in depth. Now, for those of you who don't know, we've done a whole little mini-series on some of the most notorious and extreme movies ever made. We've discussed a movie that's already been brought up a couple of times this week, Salò, 120 Days of Sodom. We've discussed Cannibal Holocaust, Holocaust, we've discussed the guinea pig movies, and we discussed Irreversible. But we're finishing the series with a Serbian film. If you sign up to Patreon at a $10 level, you will get access to that and all other exclusive mini-seasons. And it's not just extreme stuff that we cover over on Patreon. We're also just concluding our Buffy mini-series, in which we discuss all of Buffy the Vampire Slayer from beginning to end, and we're kicking off a whole bunch of new mini-seasons, including an Alfred Hitchcock retrospective, a Saw retrospective, and a Hellraiser retrospective. So all of that is available for $10 patrons, as well as a whole bunch of other bonus episodes which are available for $5 patrons, such as interviews, reviews of new releases, and mailbag episodes. Head on over to patreon.com/evolution of horror. You can sign up at a $5, $10 or $20 level. $20 will let you become an official Evolution of Horror sponsor, and I'll send you a video message to say thank you. Everybody who signs up to our Patreon from the UK will get sent an Evolution of Horror sticker, and everybody, no matter what tier or where you're from, will get a very special shout out on the podcast as a thank you. Speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who's joined up to our Patreon in the last couple of weeks a very special thanks. So a big thank you to Paul Dirk, David Ziedler, Marcus Love, Owen Grenahan, Rachel Acton, Jemmy Bihunko, Stephanie Ross, Manuel Canary, Andy Harris, Cody Watts, Austin M. Perry, Catherine Belling, Will Chichester, Julia Pickard, Sophia, Madeline Tyner, John, Duncan McPhee, Luke Kinnevy, TTT Carried, Cy Villafort, and Damien Willoughby. A huge thank you to all of those people for signing up in the last couple of weeks. And one more time, if you want to join them and get treated to regular bonus content, then sign up now. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, now you're about to hear the second half of my discussion with Dan and Zobo about the Human Centipede 2, and this is where we get into the specifics. So one more time, a big old trigger warning. We're about to talk about some of the worst moments of this film in detail. Here is the rest of our discussion on the horrible Human Centipede 2. So the film begins and we're introduced to this character of Martin, our main character, but just brilliantly played by Laurence R. Harvey, who's just amazing, isn't he?
Yeah, whose life cast from that film is currently downstairs in my bathroom.
Yes, I thought I'd seen it, yeah. So, you know, we're introduced to this character of Martin, horrible kind of horror, like the way he's portrayed, the way his life is portrayed, his home, his family, his mum, his doctor, his psychiatrist who comes to see him, who kind of leers and touches him, and you know, Zoe, what do you think of the whole setup of this film in the way that we're kind of introduced to this character of Martin and his world that he inhabits?
I mean, in some ways, you kind of want to feel sorry for him because he's not, you know, he's not having the best time. His mum, I think I put in my notes that his mum's a bit of a cunt, and he also sounds a lot like Cilla Black, which I noticed halfway through and I couldn't stop thinking about it. But yeah, and also the psychiatrist, you know, he's kind of textbook idiot, just says what he thinks is the best thing to say. And we also, obviously, we learn through the amazing dialogue, which I cannot remember what it exactly says, but it's something like, stop crying, your tears only make daddy harder, which is an interesting line to say the least. But yeah, I guess in some ways, like, you should feel sorry for him. But I think just the way he's portrayed and the things that he does from the very beginning of the film, it's hard to feel any empathy towards him. He is presented as quite a grotesque character and someone that, you know, he's obviously very, very fucked up. But I think that's, you know, I think in terms of a character, that's what makes him so great, is that he is just so everything we think about when we think of someone kind of nasty. But I do have to just point out one thing here, is that I've noticed a common trend, and I saw it in this as well, is why do the creeps and the psychos always have asthma? Because I have asthma and I'm not always pumping away on my little Ventolin. Like, I find it offensive.
It's because the hearing someone breathe when you can't see them is a horror trope. And so if you turn round and the person is next to you doing like a loud breathing, is kind of a logical extension of that horror trope. So what that is it's you unfortunately falling within the parameters of laziness in horror.
I love it. Dan, it does feel as though that they made this character in his home life as grotesque as possible. I feel like I can almost smell that flat and that bedroom where he resides, right? I mean, it's absolutely horrible.
So first off, let me tell you that you definitely can't, because we filmed that in an apartment above a pie and eel shop in East London, and it's the most horrible place I've ever been in my life.
Oh, no, so it really did smell.
Literally, they had barrels of live eels in the room below us, and they were moving around like my fucking nightmares.
Oh, no way. That's horrific.
It was like, imagine if spaghetti was made by Satan. That's what those barrels were like.
Oh my God. I thought you were going to be like, no, you can't, because it was actually just a really lovely, like, glossy, kind of high-end studio.
Horrible.
That is.
Every time we left the flat to go and like get anything from outside. So that was over in East London, and it was literally this pie and mash shop with all these fucking live eels in the back room, because they were going to jelly the poor buggers. Oh God. And every time we had to leave through the back room. Like, is this gauntlet of eels?
Oh my God. Wow. So Martin is obsessed with the Human Centipede. We see him start to kind of like capture his first couple of victims, and then there is this, I would say, one of the first big, really infamous moments of the film, which is where he's watching the Human Centipede and masturbating with sandpaper. That is... Yeah. Oh, that's tough. That's tough to watch even at that point, I think. Dan, tell us a little bit about creating that moment.
So here's a couple of things. Firstly, the eel is the opposite of the centipede. The centipede has the most legs. The eel has the least legs. They're both long, stringy buggers. So
yeah.
So there's that. The second thing is that I feel that the depiction of Martin as mentally deficient is arguably a condemnation of the mental health facilities in England, Holland, Europe in general. The idea that mental health has not been at the forefront of public health, even in Europe, which has been, at the forefront of social healthcare, and I, as a virulent lefty, have always found it very difficult to blame people for their actions when they are presented in horror as with their motive being mental illness, because it's like, oh well, you were let down by the system. Like,
yeah, totally.
If the system wasn't fucked, you wouldn't have done any of these things. Like, you don't want to do these things. Like, this is your self-care. It's just that your self-care is fucked.
I think that's true, though, isn't it? I mean, it's like Zoe said. I think, yes, it's hard to sympathise for this character, but I do think the film is kind of lending that portrayal to him, right? That he is a victim of his environment and his upbringing.
Yeah, exactly. I think how left-wing you are can be entirely dictated by how big you think Peter Sutcliffe's television should be.
The sandpaper wank, though. I mean, that's a difficult thing.
But again, I think that's about numbness, isn't it? That's about how he's been told what sexual fulfillment should be by modern media. Pornography. We know that he's an AV enthusiast. There's no way that he hasn't watched a whole bunch of porn. And yet, trying to masturbate, he's, without wanting to be too vulgar, just pulling mozzarella. There's nothing going on there. He's not getting any experience out of it. And so the sandpaper is just a ditch attempt to feel something, because he feels numb.
Ooh. How many prosthetic cocks have you had to make in your career thus far?
Literally hundreds.
That's amazing.
I thought so, yeah. Zoe, how did you find that scene? Because that was one of the first scenes that kind of really made me wince.
Oh, that's my favourite scene.
But Zoe, that's because it's early on. That's because it's before it crosses your morality threshold.
Nothing really crosses my morality threshold, but I mean, it's a horrible concept, but maybe it's harder for me to kind of find it that bad because I'm not a woman. I mean, maybe if it was if I watch something like Antichrist when she she does her snipping, that really gets me because I can almost feel. I can't, but I can imagine what that feels like. But with the sandpaper thing, I'm like, well, it must hurt, but I can't imagine it too much. And I really like your analogy about it, Dan. The fact that he's kind of numb and searching for something to make him feel alive. And I guess, also I've done a lot of sandpapering in my house, and it does depend on the grade of the sandpaper, because the fine one is like a tickle if you get it right.
Oh God. It's true. And then there's another really key moment of ultra violence, I think, in that first act, which is where he smashes his mum's head in, and that's quite a prolonged scene of violence, and you see that head get caved in. Now, it's that kind of violence we have seen in other films. In fact, Dan, it reminded me a lot of Ben Wheatley's Kill List, the moment when he smashes that guy's head in with the hammer. It's kind of the same here, right? Although it's not a hammer, is it? What is it he uses?
It's a hammer in Kill List. It's a crowbar.
That's
in
That's
Centipede.
it. Yeah.
So you have to remember, I didn't do Kill List.
Yes.
I joined Ben's team after Kill List. The Centipede, like the head crush, because it's a narrative turning point, that was always in the film, and so that was one of the ones that John had already kind of like figured out. So all the stuff that I brought to the film was ephemera, was just like making it nastier. Mm-hmm. So while I did make the head that was crushed, I did it in John's workshop. It was to John's specifications. And actually it was ultimately ended up feeding back into Ben's stuff, and was part of why I ended up being Ben's effects artist, was because on a zombie short that my wife produced for Ben, Assault on Sun Hill, we had to do a head smash, and I used the technique that I had sort of learned from John on Human Centipede 2.
Love it.
So essentially it's a soft foam skin over a very brittle plastic understructure, and then you fill it with whatever viscera and grue fits the tone of the scene.
Love it. So
in the instance of Human Centipede 2, it was just fake blood, methyl cellulose and banana.
Never going to eat bananas in the same way.
They're almost all bananas. Like, if anything you watch that I've done where a head gets bust open, it's
bananas.
Banana,
yeah. When he's then got all of his victims together, Zoe, then I believe, right, there's almost no dialogue from about the halfway point all the way through to the end, while he is then just creating his centipede, right, and watching it happen. First of all, you get all those moments when he's like, kind of destroying their kneecaps. There's that moment when he sort of cuts that man's arse open. He's smashing the teeth. Zoe, what did you think of this sequence in which he actually kind of starts putting together the centipede? Because I don't know about you, this, I suppose, is kind of what I was expecting to see in the first film.
Yeah, I mean, these are exactly the bits that you expect to see in the first film, where it's kind of where the gruesome construction of the centipede is happening.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if it's the right word to say I really enjoy this bit, but there's a lot to take away from it.
That's the right phrase. You should say you enjoy that bit. Yeah,
that is the right phrase.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yes. Then I really enjoyed this bit, and one bit that really makes me like quite squeamish is the cutting of the knees, and I guess it's either the ligament or the tendon where they snip through. Yeah, that one I'm like, yeah, watching that, you kind of, you know, when you're moving in your seat just going, yep, that's happening. And then I love the butt cutting scene. Like, it's so well done. It's so gory as well. And then what I love the most is obviously he bleeds out. And I love that Martin kind of starts squeaking and crying, and he's so devastated that, you know, he didn't want to kill these people. He just wanted his little pet centipede. And I think that might be the only moment of the film where I was like, oh, poor thing. Like, he's fucked up a bit here.
Dan, what was it like, you know, first of all, for you creating this stuff in this sequence, but also just all of those actors, those 12 actors, as well as Laurence, obviously, in this particular sequence when they're all there screaming and being attacked and being mutilated and all of that stuff. What was that like on set?
Well, I think one of my favourite bits about the arse cutting sequence is the sort of fruitless staunching of bleed, where he's like, oh no. And he starts trying to put pressure on the wound, like,
this isn't supposed to happen.
Like he was unprepared for this event. I said earlier that we all got kind of numb to nudity. It was super fucking weird. I refer to it as lobstering. You know the myth that, like, lobsters don't jump out of the pot because the water heats around them gradually, and they're like, well, this is fine.
Yes.
and then they just boil to death because they're fucking idiots. I think to some extent that was happening with us on set. Like, I'd turn up and we'd all be like, hey, how you doing? How was last night? Oh, you get a good night's sleep, you know, blah, 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 small talk. And then we get to about 11 and I'd have some horrible idea and I'd pitch it to Tom and he'd be like, yeah, that's great, go off to your studio and make that off. So I'd hand over to my team and then I'd turn back up like 2 hours later and I'd leave completely inured to the fact that I was surrounded by 12 naked people and one nearly naked man. And then I'd come back in and it was like walking back into a cold front. Like, you get really like smacked in the face by it.
These actors must have been incredibly good sports, really, to go through this.
They really were. They really were. Like, there was so much. I mean, fuck, I don't know. I did a bit of acting in my youth, and I'm not sure I could have ever put up with this bullshit.
Yeah. I can imagine.
I did wonder watching it, like, how long at a time did they have to be that close to another person's arsehole? Because,
well, you know, the bums aren't real.
They're not real. Oh, that's so disappointing.
They're all wearing silicone bums.
Okay, that's nicer.
Everyone came in and got their bum cast, and then we made like silicone pants for everyone that had their own bum on the outside.
Yeah, because I was watching it and I was thinking, I was like, I know it's a movie. I was like, but, you know, I was like, it's not really the nicest position to be in, even if you're just filming. So, yeah, bum casts, that sounds better.
Yeah, and even the gaffer tape and stuff was fake. Like, we built these harnesses in such a way that they could just like strap on and strap off. Like, we didn't have to tape everyone in every time.
That makes sense. So it wasn't as grueling as it might appear.
No, I mean, because of the sheer number of people, it still took like a good 5 to 10 minutes to get everyone in and out. But yeah, if you were actually gaffer taping everyone into those situations, it would take like 25, 30 minutes. So,
I mean, obviously, like Zoe mentioned, Tom Six is quite a personality publicly, he seems like, on Twitter and everything else. He's clearly quite a provocateur. What did you think of him, Dan, to work with him? How was Tom, like, on set on days like that?
I mean, Tom's a really convivial chap. And actually, my main memory of set was the fact that he insisted on wearing a white linen suit. And so it became a competition amongst my team and myself to try and get fake shit on him.
Amazing. Let's get to the shit, shall we? I mean, he creates his centipede. He has to give him a laxative because it's not, and that's a moment that really makes me laugh. You know, when he's just watching them all and he just starts going and just starts like, making shitting noises, trying to get them to go. Then he injects them all with laxative, and then we have the shitstorm, literally, that happens. So was this one of the moments that kind of pushed you over the edge, Zoe? Was this reaching your limit at this point? Because it certainly was for me.
Yeah, but it wasn't even necessarily like the shit itself. Like, you know, I could, you know, as you know, like Salo is one of my all-time favorite films, and yeah, it's a bit gross, but I don't get like super grossed out by shit. I mean, I used to look after kids for many years, and also like older kids who still wore nappies. So to me, it's just, you know, it is what it is. Like, it's just a human function. I think it's more when he's got his barbed wire and he's, you know, taken to the girl at the back, where it was just that bit. I was like, after all the shit and the laxatives, and then going in with the barbed wire, I was like, it's just not a nice thing to be doing, to be honest. And obviously, you know, it is a rape scene, which is not very nice. And you add the fact of all of the diarrhea and then the barbed wire, and I think I kind of was just like, oh yeah, maybe I'm all right at this bit.
It's a hat on a hat at that point.
Yeah, you're kind of going, oh yeah, this has gotten pretty nasty.
I'm going to come to that scene in a minute. Dan, let me just ask you, because on IMDb trivia it says that the feces in the film was a combination of cocoa powder, condensed milk, and crushed ginger biscuits, and the concoction was apparently so delicious that members of the cast and crew were snacking on set. Is that true?
So my favourite thing about that is that they've missed out what I think is the best fact about the fake shit, which is that when Salo was released in Italy, the press pack included the recipe for the fake shit.
Amazing.
And I have a copy of the original Italian press pack for for Salo.
Brilliant. Of course you do.
And so when I got the call for Centipede, I was like, well, I mean, I know how to make shit. I know from the great. I've got the best recipe possible. And so I turned up to set with all this fake shit. And Tom was like, oh no, it has to be liquids. Like, we need liquid shit. And I'm like, well, God. I can probably tweak this recipe to make it liquid. And he's like, but also this person's lactose intolerant and this person can't have gluten.
So that is all true then, right?
Wow.
And I'm like, okay, all right, so I have to modify this recipe. And by the time we'd had this conversation, all of the fake shit I'd brought with me had been eaten.
That is
like
brilliant.
Off camera, because it is genuinely like Pasolini's recipe for shit is super delicious.
Dan, I feel like I would like to ask if I can have that recipe for my next dinner party.
Yeah,
that would be fucking hilarious.
Yeah. I'll give you the recipe. I'll give you that recipe, and I'll give you the bad taste vomit recipe as well.
Amazing.
You know what we should do is one day have host a horror themed dinner party where we could all go to. And we could have it under a cloche, like a big platter. Of
you can have.
Salad
What's the thing where the French aristocrats put the blanket over their head and eat the baby birds to hide themselves from God, but instead you're eating like Salo shit, bad taste vomit,
yes,
and in fabric semen.
Yes, amazing. I love it.
And knocking it all down with Duke of Burgundy piss. So.
I love it. So we get that. We get the huge amount of shit eating, and it's kind of like, well, where does it go from here, right? And we're nearly towards the end, and I think, you know, this is it. Like you said, Dan, it's a kind of like upward trajectory of grossness and depravity, and then we get to this scene that you alluded to, Zoe, which is this kind of barbed wire rape scene, which is really horrible to watch. And this scene, I believe, was actually completely cut in its entirety from the version that is available in the UK. Is that right, Dan? That this moment is not there in the sort of the cut that you can see on Shudder, for example. Yeah,
like normally I'm very antsy about sexual violence. Mm-hmm. I'm not like, I don't feel that that's really my like realm to work in. But also, I don't feel like I'm qualified to determine what's acceptable or not within that, as someone who hasn't ever experienced that. And obviously, I've not experienced having my fucking head cut off, but like, there are parameters that you set yourself, but because of the Salo thing, because of the like deliberately trying to make something that was as affronting as possible, we had a one close-up shot that was done entirely with puppets of the sexual assault that was never used, and to be, with hindsight, I'm very glad. I'm glad I'm glad it wasn't used, but it was a very unpleasant sequence.
Zoe, we've talked quite a lot already, haven't we, about extreme cinema and how different extreme movies handle rape. We talked at length about the movie Irreversible and compare that to how sexual assault is treated in maybe some 70s films and that kind of thing. What's your opinion on this particular sequence and how it's handled?
Do you know what? I think it's actually handled quite well. I mean, I don't think watching a rape scene is never going to be a nice experience ever, but I think considering everything else that's out there, it doesn't go on for too long. You don't see anything close up, and I think actually considering all the circumstances around Martin and a lot of the acts he's done, I feel like if it wasn't included, it almost would feel like a deliberate exclusion because perhaps worried about offending someone, which I think maybe wouldn't feel quite right. We know Martin has a sexual obsession with the Human Centipede, so it's almost expected that he's going to do that. So I think actually with all that considered, it is handled really well, and it's also it's not like male gazy, it's not gratuitous, it's not close-up shots of the girl or anything like that. So I think, considering all of those things, it's not too bad, against a lot of the other stuff that's out there. Yeah,
I agree. So then I guess all that's left to talk about is the final, the pièce de résistance that happens in this film, which is the infanticide, the moment where the pregnant woman escapes from the warehouse. She's gone into labour. She jumps into a car and the baby is born, right? The baby pops out and falls onto the floor of the car. She can either now put her foot on the gas to drive away and escape, thereby killing her newborn, or she can die trying to save her newborn and pick it up. And she makes that choice. She slams her foot on the pedal. She squashes the newborn baby in graphic detail. What did you think of this scene?
Yeah, I think the first time I watched it, I was a bit like, oh shit, they actually went there. I think, when you've got the pregnant woman, I think the whole time through the film, you kind of expect that something's going to happen to her, but I don't think you ever think that it's really going to go down that route. And I think it is quite shocking, but more so because, obviously I've watched films like a Serbian film, and we all know about that baby scene,
that's much worse. Yeah.
But then again, that's...
Is it worse, Mike?
I found a lot of a Serbian film really silly, but there is a moment involving a baby that I found personally harder to watch and less outright silly than this moment.
I don't know, because it's almost like, I guess the thing for me in Human Centipede 2 is like, this is a pregnant woman who's grown a child for 9 months in her stomach, which is a pretty, amazing thing to do. And she's so desperate to get out of there that she is fine. And she definitely has at least 1 minute to pick up the baby and put him on the seat next to her. And she just goes, fuck it, I'm going to crush him because because I want to get away so quickly. And I was like, geez, come on, pick him up.
Well, that's the thing. It feels
there was time.
It feels like a little bit of a joke to me almost. But what I do find interesting as well is that it's not harm done by Martin, right? This was this was one of the only moments of violence. Like, we don't actually see Martin inflict any violence on any children in this film, right? Even when we see the infanticide happen at the end, which is quite interesting.
Well, I don't think he ever would, because I think, he was obviously an abused child himself. And although he's obviously, got his own problems and he's fucked up from it, he probably wouldn't abuse a child because he was the abused child. But yeah, I think that's maybe why for me that baby scene is almost kind of worse than others, because she's doing it to her own baby. And like I said, she should have just picked up the poor sod,
Yeah.
Well, so let me interject here and say that baby death was not in the script.
Interesting.
She never gave birth in the original script. She had this silicone prosthetic stomach that she wore for a number of days. And I was like, well, look, I can just cut like a little mouse hole in the bottom of it. We can take out the foam insert and I can fit this soft baby up in it. And we can shoot an over shoulder of the baby coming out, like of a birth from above. Which is why you'll notice that there is no umbilicus in the birth.
Uh-huh.
And I said, look, I think it would be really good if the baby's head went under the accelerator pedal, and if, like, when Martin is dawning down on her, she is forced to decide between her saving herself and thus killing the child, or killing both, like sacrificing both of them. That's the best, like, choice you can put in front of a new mother in a horror film, because she can save her own life by crushing her own child under the accelerator pedal, or she can refuse to do that and scrabble about trying to pick up this like slimy vernix umbilicus covered child and get fucking shot in the head by a mad tubby film fan.
I love it. So that was all you're doing, Dan. I love it.
Yeah. And I pitched it to Tom ahead of lunch, and I was like, look, we've got two rubber babies. Let me hollow the head out of one of them. I can show you a cranial crush on one of them in like 60 minutes. And he was like, yeah, fucking show me that. That sounds great. And I made a little on my like Nokia, like pre-iPhone, on my Nokia phone, I filmed me like squishing the head of this baby on camera. And he was like, I love it. It's amazing. Let's do it. And brilliant. That's the end of the film. That's how it got there.
That's incredible. There you go. I love it. Well, it's really interesting, isn't it? Let me finish off by asking you guys about the kind of the response, the legacy of this film, I suppose, over the last 10 years. Zoe, it is often labelled, isn't it, one of the most extreme movies of the sort of 21st century, one of the most shocking and depraved movies you can watch. What are your thoughts on that? As somebody who's seen a lot of extreme movies, where do you think this movie does kind of rank, I suppose, in that conversation?
I think it's definitely up there. I mean, you've got everything in there. If you're looking for an extreme film and you're going, right, how can I, see all of the, like you said, Dan, with the kind of checklist of things that the BBFC wouldn't like and that kind of check all the boxes for extreme cinema. You have it in here. And also I think, it's produced well, it's made well, the effects are good. It's not, there's a lot of films out there that probably want to be like this, but look like, it looks like I shot it on my iPhone, and trust me, I can't even take a good picture.
That's the thing. Sorry, Zoe.
No, go on, Dan.
I'd say this is one of the best extreme films that is both modern and good.
Yeah. That's the thing. Like, I guess it's hard to watch because it's not very nice in places and it's pretty disturbing, but also it's easy to watch because it has a storyline, it goes along, and it's not just a piece of shit. Like, it's an actual good film and a good extreme film.
Yeah, it's not just your Red Sin Towers. It's not just murder set pieces. It's like, it's a proper movie.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. It's and I mean, I'm very excited to see his latest movie, which I have a feeling it's going to cause a bit of controversy as well.
Is this the one where? Is this the one in the trailer where the women were masturbating to footage of 9/11? Yeah, brilliant. And to think people call him a provocateur. Dan, what did you think? I mean, when this movie came out and the response it got, was that kind of exactly the response you were predicting when you were making this film?
Yeah, I mean, like, to be bitterly honest, like, there was such a delayed release on this that I'd kind of moved on to other stuff by the time it came out. So by the time it came out, I was like, well, yeah, that's what we were doing. Like, it was always meant to be difficult. It was always meant to be hard. And I think that's what Tom does very well. He's a deliberately challenging director.
Yeah.
And I hope that going forwards, he manages to maintain that, but also maintain like a narrative structure and accessible characters.
Yeah. Agreed. So there you go. Before we wrap up, we're gonna end with a few recommendations. We want to hear from you guys, Dan and Zobo, about what other kind of extreme depraved movies such as this one you would recommend out there, because you guys have got such a good vast knowledge of this. But first of all, let's head over to our new regular segment, Wild About Horror. I, for one, cannot wait to hear what Freudian cinephile Mary Wild has to say about The Human Centipede 2.
Hey Mike, Mary Wild reporting again. This week, my film analysis serves the additional function of confronting a genuine fear I have of the human centipede. I've watched hundreds of horror films since childhood, but Tom Six's movie is the one that disturbed me the most. Despite this, or maybe because of it, I have a lot of affection for Tom Six and anxiously await his next project, the Onania Club. He's been accused of being a vile, trollish edgelord and derided by leading lights of the film criticism establishment. But this is exactly why I admire him. Cinema needs the spirit of the trickster provocateur to push boundaries, offend, and cause a stir. Maybe I'm alone in this, but I'm interested in knowing what the trashy artistic types have to say, and less keen to hear the moralistic sermons of the so-called great and the good. In the Human Centipede first sequence, the idea of conjoining people mouth to anus is introduced as medical research, and very little gore is actually depicted on screen. The effect here is that a certain theoretical distance takes place, and the concept of humans connected via their digestive tract occupies a predominantly academic realm. Dieter Laser plays the sadistic German surgeon Dr. Heiter, an authoritarian and obscenely depraved character that Tom Six intentionally aligns with Nazism and the warped obsession of capturing innocent people and subjecting them to gruesome experiments. Maintaining the intellectual remoteness of the torture enables the antagonist in the first sequence to commit atrocities without a crisis of conscience. The barbarism remains in this fear of the unspeakable, precisely because the abject physical reality of surgically attached bodies is never fully revealed, merely implied, mostly embedded in a sterilized clinical environment. In The Human Centipede 2, Laurence Harvey delivers an unforgettable performance as the psychiatrically and intellectually impaired Englishman Martin Lomax, who compulsively watches the film's first sequence and decides to make his own centipede consisting of 12 people. The film begins with Martin watching The Human Centipede on his laptop in the toll booth of a London parking garage where he is employed. This direct link creates a sequential chain we pick up in the second film where the first one left off. Martin's fanatical preoccupation is centered on the ideological fallout of Dr. Heiter's disgusting operation. Tom Six was inspired to make the sequel in the form of a metafilm after reporters kept asking if he worried about inspiring copycat crimes. Here, the director gleefully overindulges in the scientifically unsupported idea that movies have the power to incite audiences to commit heinous crimes. Now, the academic concept of the human centipede manifests as the real-life goal of an obsessed fan who carries out the experiment on kidnapped victims in a dingy warehouse. Instead of actual surgery tools to assemble his centipede, Martin crudely uses a staple gun and duct tape to attach each person's lips to the next person's buttocks. He injects victims with a syringe of laxative, forcing each of them to explosively evacuate their bowels into the mouth of the person behind them, the sight of which causes Martin to jubilantly laugh before vomiting in disgust. He then wraps his genitals in barbed wire and rapes the woman at the end of the centipede. Tonally, it's a completely different film to the first one. Gone are theoretical implications and lofty research ambitions. Here we are in the domain of the nitty-gritty, the brass tacks. We see blood, shit, and rape. We see Martin being sodomized by his beloved pet centipede, who fulfills Dr. Sebring's prophecy that it is a phallic symbol. We see the death of a newborn baby that is so warped it approaches slapstick proportions. We see so much we can almost smell it, almost taste it. Martin does not actually have any dialogue in the film except for a few laughs and moans. Unlike the talkative and professorial Dr. Heiter, Martin is silent. He is an action-oriented man, dragging the scientific discourse into a grisly orgy of ass to mouth. The Human Centipede 2 full sequence received generally negative reviews and was heavily censored throughout the world, or sometimes banned altogether. What makes this film fascinating is that it combines the two stages of psychosexual development, oral and anal, and forces the viewer to remain trapped within the most extreme aspects of those confines, doubling down to ensure that we are well and truly lodged at the intersection of dual impulses of eating and excreting. I would argue that it is the idea of being orally and anally fixated, and not necessarily the graphic depictions of body horror, that became the true object of controversy and moral outrage against this film. What later transpires in the third and final sequence of Tom Six's trilogy is the absurdist tale of a deranged warden who is persuaded to create a 500-person human centipede as a solution to his prison's notorious problems. This is a reference to the director's concept for the first film, arising from his joke about punishing a child molester by stitching his mouth to the anus of a fat truck driver. So, the third sequence, staging prisoners in a human centipede as payment for their crimes, connects the narrative back to the inception point, literally stitching all the ideas together in a chain of signification. I read a YouTube comment by someone named Ash Knight who said that Tom Six's trilogy is a centipede in 3 segments, each one simply digesting the shit of the last, and I think this is a very clever explanation. The Human Centipede 2 is a topographical nightmare in which Martin, who was sexually abused as a child by his father, perpetuates the cycle of abuse by turbocharging his own victimization against other people. The centipede is an uncanny symbol of elements repeating in a pattern, moving together in the same direction, and so befits the character of Martin, who is the embodiment of trauma piled up and recurring inside of him, leading him to externalize his own suffering in the form of a daisy chain from hell. Till next time.
A big thank you there to the amazing Mary Wild. Don't forget, if you want to hear more of Mary's takes on genre films and other stuff, you can listen to her podcast that she co-hosts with Sarah Cleaver. That's called The Projections Podcast. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want any information about Mary's upcoming courses, I would hugely recommend them. Then follow her on Twitter for details. You can find her there at PsychStar. Okay, Dan, Zobo, we're going to wrap up shortly. We finished on Human Centipede 2, but let me just finish by asking you, as two aficionados of extreme cinema, I want to ask, if there's anyone out there listening who is maybe for the first time just sort of dipping their toe into the world of body horror and extreme cinema, what would you recommend? Where would you go from here? I just want to ask for a few quick recommendations from the both of you. So Zobo, let's start with you. Do you have any recommendations off the back of the Human Centipede 2?
Oh, I've got a few. So obviously I'd say, if you're going to watch Human Centipede 2, you may as well do the full trilogy. The third one, honestly, is a bit of a spoiler, but man, I think he gets raped in his kidney, which shouldn't be funny, but I pissed myself laughing. There's also, which came to mind, was The Golden Glove. I know you spoke about that on the serial killers episode with Brad a bit, but that one, quite a grimy, smelly kind of film. And then just thinking about some other ones that maybe aren't produced quite as nicely, but are tough to watch and very grotesque and disgusting. I would say Mum and Dad, which is a bit of an underground British film, home movie as well, about a couple of kids that want to slaughter their parents. Obviously, August Underground, and also a film called Pig from 2010, which is notoriously difficult to get hold of. But even the director said it was so horrible they didn't want anyone to watch it again.
Brilliant. Amazing. I've heard so much about August Underground. I feel like I should give it a go at some point. Dan, have you... no? No?
No.
Not a fan, Dan?
August Underground is the opposite of Human Centipede 2 in that it is horrible for the sake of it with absolutely zero artistic value.
Okay. All right.
But it's fun.
Well, okay, so Mike asked me to put together a list of also rans of extreme / body horror.
Yeah.
And there is one of the August Underground / akin peripheral August Underground films on here. Do you want to hear the rundown?
Go for it.
All right, so in chronological order, and missing out Salo from 75 because you've already talked about it on the podcast, we're going to go with, also from 1975, Giuseppe Ferrara's Face of the Spy, aka CIA Secret Story, which is the legitimately first torture porn film. It is unbelievably unpleasant if you can get a hold of it, if you want to get a hold of it. Ooh. It's very hard to find these days, but it's, oh my fucking God. I can hear Zobo typing.
I literally am.
I know.
Make a note of that one.
From 1980, Umberto Lenzi's Cannibal Ferox, which is a lower brow Cannibal Holocaust. From 82, Keith Lee's Centipede Horror, which is a Japanese body horror about internalized centipede breeding.
Oh, it's bad though.
Which includes a lot of sequences which Myth has created the story that people would swallow centipedes and a paste that would keep the centipedes alive so that they could vomit up live centipedes on camera.
Oh, Jesus.
So that's a thing. Obviously, you've talked about the guinea pig films, but the whole series is worth checking out. It starts with Hideshi Hino's original Centipede in 85, but goes through from Flowers of Flesh and Blood, all the way through He Won't Die, Mermaid in a Manhole. There's loads of them, and they get progressively wackier and weirder. But there's some fun stuff in there. I think He Won't Die is one of my favourite of the non-core narratives. It's about a guy that discovers he's immortal and decides to use it to bully his ex-girlfriend.
Oh God.
By repeatedly committing suicide in front of her. From 1980, so those are from 80. The original Guinea Pig is 85. From 86, there's In a Glass Cage by Auguste Villaronga.
Yes.
It's a Spanish super nasty
cute movie.
Revenge horror. It's an amazing film. It's about a suicide survivor who is in an iron lung, and by an iron lung I mean a glass box, who hires a caretaker, or vicariously hires a caretaker, who turns out to be someone that they were involved with during their time as a Nazi. Oh my God, it's horrible. So that's a very, very I mean, all of these are caveated recommendations. G.F. Mouse's Men Behind the Sun from 88.
Oh God, Zoe told me about this and it gave me like nightmares.
Yeah, it's utterly fucking horrible. Men Behind the Sun, Evil Dead Trap by Tishihiro Ieda, from 88, which is almost like a Japanese body horror giallo. It's incredible. Like the kills are so over the fucking top. It's insane. You got some Fulci-esque eye piercings. It's absolutely insane. But like at its core, it's actually a very good mystery thriller. So yeah, actually that's one of the ones I'd recommend higher than most of the others. From 92, you've got Katsu Matsumura's All Night Long trilogy, which starts then and went on for 3 films. As far as I can tell, it got banned for being like a guide to stalking, but it has. It's that's some pretty effed up S. From 94, there's a short film by Nacha Serda called Aftermath. Aftermath is noteworthy because it's as far as I was concerned at least, the origin of a Spanish special effects house called DDT. In Aftermath, they do a lot of stuff with necrophilia. So they made a lot of like fuckable bodies. So Pep Tozar, who's an amazing Spanish actor, is in that movie, and he has anecdotes on a couple of making-ofs about that film where he would like break scene to go and be sick because of what they were filming. So make of that what you will. Red Room from Daisuke Yamanouchi from 99, which is one of the first abduction torture porns. Again, coming out of Japan. That's really extreme. I didn't particularly enjoy it.
No, it's pretty shit, to be honest.
Yeah, but it's worth noting as like a step in the transition of the genre. Subconscious Cruelty, directed by Karim Hussein, who ended up being the cinematographer on Possessor, which is amazing and does have someone masturbating over a picture of the Queen while their penis is being skinned, so that's good. There's a French-Canadian body horror, which I like. Of this list, is probably my favourite. It's called In My Skin.
Yes.
I know it as Dans ma peau, directed by Marina Devin from 2002. It's an absolute fucking masterpiece. It's been released nearly nowhere. There's a French-Canadian DVD. I think there's also an American DVD released in French. I can't recommend it highly enough. I really like it's a slow burn, but it's fuck me, it's amazing.
That's one incredible. I rewatched it the other day because I'm doing a podcast tomorrow on it. It's one of my favorite extreme films ever.
Yeah, awesome. It's absolutely incredible. It's about autofixation. In this case, about the sexualization of self-harm, and like self-validation through the destruction of self, like that amazing like negative dichotomy. It's such a good film. I cannot recommend it highly enough. Like a lot of these, like you look at like Men Behind the Sun and Necromantic, and they're just courting controversy. Like they're just trying to be problematic. But In My Skin is, oh my god, it's otherworldly. It's a genuinely great film. On the next level, Martin Locke's 2003 film Bread and Circus is just spectacle. I think there's probably a political message in there somewhere, but it's drowned out by the horror. As even more so is Lucifer Valentine's 2006 film Slaughtered Vomit Dolls.
Oh god.
Yeah. I can hear Zoe recoiling. All of the sick is real in that film.
Yeah.
So that's a vomit horror. I don't recommend it at all.
No, never watch that. It's not worth it.
And then finally going on to Grotesque, which was the film, and I don't think it's very good, the film that got refused a certificate by the BBFC like 3 days before Human Centipede 2, thus technically robbing Human Centipede 2 of its first film banned in 30 years.
Oh no. Oh no.
Yeah. So there you go. That's all. That's my also ran body horror.
I love it. What an incredible list. I will probably be watching none of those, but thank you for the list anyway. For people that wanna check some of those out. Zoe, I expect you've jotted down a couple of titles there.
I have jotted down a couple of titles. So yeah. Always looking for more fucked up shit to watch. You know how it is.
Love it.
So if there's any you can't find, message me and I'll just send you them.
Don't worry, I'm already on it. I've already drafted that message.
Amazing. Guys, this has been such a pleasure, which is, amazing really, considering what we've been discussing. So thank you so much for joining me. Zoe, tell us where we can find you and more of your stuff out there in the world.
I, as always, am just at Zobo with a shotgun. Watching more fucked up films. So, yeah.
We'll be discussing a Serbian film together on Patreon very soon in the next couple of weeks as well. So keep an eye out for that little gem.
Can't bloody wait.
I can't wait. And Dan, we're going to be talking about Possessor in a couple of weeks' time as well on the main podcast. But where else can people find you and more of your stuff out there?
I'm at 13FingerFX, the letters F and X, on both Twitter and Instagram. Follow me there. Twitter is more like brain vomit, and Instagram is more behind the scenes and work stuff.
Perfect. Guys, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much.
And that's it for this week. If you made it to the end of the episode, then thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my brilliant, cine-literate, knowledgeable guests, Dan Martin and Zobo with a shotgun. Thank you so much to Mary Wild for this week's Wild About Horror, and of course, thank you so much to the one and only Laurence Harvey, the star of Human Centipede 2. It's been a joy, actually, doing this week's episode for me and kind of working through my thoughts when it comes to this film. Now, I would love to hear your thoughts. What do you guys make of this film? Do you want to stick up for it as a kind of new version of something like Sallow, as a profound, depraved masterpiece? Or is it simply a load of trash? Please do get in touch and let me know what you think. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. And if you want to discuss this week's film and anything else horror related with fellow listeners, then join our discussion group. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group, and that can be found on Facebook. If you want to support this podcast financially and be treated to regular bonus episodes, then sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/evolution of horror. You can find all previous episodes and seasons of this podcast on our website. Head on over to evolutionofhorror.com. You can find this podcast on all major podcast platforms, and if you get a spare minute, please could you drop us a little rating or review on Apple Podcasts, which really helps us get discovered by new listeners. Okay then, well, I wish I could say that the pain and misery and torture stops there, but it doesn't. We're nearly through it, I promise, but next week we've got another 2 pretty bleak, grisly films to discuss. Next week I'm going to be joined by friend of the pod, filmmaker and Dan Martin's co-host on the Arrow Video podcast, Sam Ashurst, and we are going to be discussing the work of none other than Lars von Trier. This will be the first time we discuss Lars von Trier on the podcast. We're going to have plenty to talk about. We are going to be discussing in depth Antichrist from 2009 and The House That Jack Built from 2018. Yikes. Join us next week for all of this and more on the evolution of horror.